On a spring morning in 1913, a 9-year-old girl spent her last free hours knocking on doors. She went from house to house down her own street, in her own small town, selling little packets of sewing needles for her church, a red sweater, a straw hat, a friendly, familiar face that half the town knew by name. Door after door after door. And then, somewhere between one of those doors and the next, she was gone. Not chased, not dragged away screaming, not bundled into a carriage in front of witnesses. Nothing so clear as that. One minute she was a local child, doing an ordinary errand in broad daylight. The next, there was simply an empty space on the sidewalk where Catherine Winters used to be. More than 100 years later, that empty space has never been filled. And here is the strange way I want you to think about this case, because it is the only way it makes any sense. A girl who spent her morning walking through doors, then walked out of the world through one final door that nobody ever found. And for the last century, everyone who has touched this story has been trying to work out which door it was. There are several. A door leading out to the open road. A door leading to a passing stranger. A door leading to distant relatives. And a door leading back into her own home. Let me take you through every one of them, because each door looks, for a moment, like the answer, and every single one of them turns out to be locked. Stick with me to the end and decide for yourself which door she went through. But first, if a real, unsolved historical mystery is exactly your kind of thing, the subscribe button keeps them coming. Start with the morning, because you need to understand how impossible this vanishing really was. The 20th of March, 1913, Newcastle, Indiana. It should not even have been a school day. Measles was moving through the town, and the schools had shut their doors to slow it down. So Catherine, 9 years old, in the 4th grade, had a free morning ahead of her. She was, by the small details that survive, a real and specific child. She had a doll she loved. She had a favorite window seat in the house where she liked to curl up. She had an independent streak, the kind of girl who could be trusted to go out on her own and knock on a stranger's door. And there is a sadness sitting in that house already, before anything even happens. The woman raising Catherine was not her mother. Her real mother, Etta, had died years earlier of tuberculosis. She had been taken far from home to Colorado, to a city people believed was kinder to the lungs of the sick. She died there young. She was buried back in her own family's ground. Catherine was only a small child at the time. Her father remarried. So the woman at home that day was her stepmother. Hold that quietly. It matters at the last door. That morning, Catherine played with a friend who had a dollhouse. Then she set out on her rounds with her packets of needles, and she was seen. That is the part that makes this case so maddening. She was seen constantly. She walked the length of the town, straight through the busy business district. She passed directly beneath the window of her own father's dental office. More than a dozen people who knew her greeted her or watched her go by. Neighbors, acquaintances, ordinary adults who thought nothing of a familiar child out doing her church rounds on a spring day. The last person who is widely believed to have spoken to her was a family friend named Dan Monroe. He said they traded a few words near the town square. It was around noon. She was a single block from the county courthouse, the very center of town, in the full light of day. And that is the last solid moment in the whole story. Because after that, the trail does not merely go cold. It shatters. Different people swore they saw her afterward, at different hours, in different places, streets apart. Those sightings did not guide the search. They broke it. From the first day, nobody could even agree where she had last been, so nobody knew where to begin. Think about how paralyzing that is for a search. One witness placed her in one part of town. Another placed her somewhere else entirely, at an hour that did not match. The reported sightings were separated by streets and by hours, and they could not all be true. Every one of them had to be taken seriously. Every one of them sent searchers in a different direction, and so the effort scattered outward in a dozen contradictory lines at once, in the exact hours when a tight, focused search might still have found something. The confusion of that first day may have quietly doomed the whole case before it had properly begun. That evening, she did not come home for dinner. Her stepmother telephoned her father at his office. He rushed home and began to search. He retraced her route. He hammered on doors until his knuckles were raw. He shouted her name until his voice failed him. He found nothing. And already, on that first night, there is a detail that has troubled people for a century. The family did not call the police, not that night. They waited until the following day. That same night, the rain began. It was the first night of the catastrophic floods of 1913, the water rising across Indiana. So by the time the search was official, a child had been missing for many hours, in a storm, with no agreement about where she had last been seen. And when the town finally threw itself into the search, the scale of it was staggering. This was not a handful of officers walking a few streets. The whole town seemed to stop and pour outside. People left their work. Factory hands, shopkeepers, school children, Boy Scouts, an entire community walking the fields, the riverbanks, the rail lines, calling one little girl's name into the rain. The longer it went on with no result, the more stunned they became. All those hands, all that effort, and the ground giving back nothing at all. One private detective described it in a line that has never been bettered. It was, he said, as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed her whole. And into that chaos, her father threw open the first door. Immediately, without hesitation, he decided she had been taken by gypsies. I use that word because it is the word of the era, and it sits at the heart of the case. It refers to Romani travelers, and to the town of Newcastle in 1913. This was not a wild guess. It was the obvious answer. A band of Romani travelers had reportedly passed through town that very day. People said they had stopped to water their horses at a public trough, and several townsfolk claimed they had seen Catherine standing nearby, watching them. For that town, in that time, this door practically opened itself. The traveling stranger who snatches a child was one of the great fears of the age. It meant the horror had come from outside. It meant no neighbor, and certainly no family, had done anything wrong. So the whole force of the search rushed through that door. It became something enormous. Trains bound for Chicago were stopped and searched. Parties spread out across state lines, chasing Romani families through the countryside and up into Wisconsin, town by town. Every band of travelers with a little girl among them was hunted down and inspected, and every time, it came to nothing. In one Wisconsin town, searchers found a traveling man and his family, and for a heartbeat there was hope. There were children with them, and one of them was a little girl, but she was not Catherine. In another town, a band of fortune-tellers was stopped and searched. Again, children among them. Again, not the girl from Indiana. Time after time, a report would come in that a strange group had a little girl with them, and time after time, it turned out to be somebody else's child entirely. The children were never Catherine. The families had been traveling those same roads for years. There was never a single thread of evidence that any Romani traveler had ever laid eyes on Catherine Winters, let alone taken her. The door that had looked so obvious, that pointed the blame so conveniently away from the town, simply swung open onto an empty room. But that door was so loud and so satisfying to the fears of the town that it drowned out a second door, one that stood right there the whole time and that almost nobody noticed. Because 6 days before Catherine vanished, another little girl had been taken off the streets of that same town. Her name was Helen Milliken. She was 8 years old. An unidentified man in a rented buggy had taken her, driven her out of the city, and then let her go. She survived, but the man was never found, never named, never caught. A stranger in a hired buggy had taken a child off a public street in daylight, and then he simply melted back into the countryside, as though he had never existed. 6 days later, Catherine Winters was gone. 2 young girls, one small Indiana town, 1 week, and as far as the records show, the investigators never seriously connected the two. The town was so fixed on the traveling strangers, so certain the danger had ridden in and ridden out with the Romani, and so the very real possibility of a single predator quietly working those streets was barely examined at all. That door was left standing wide open, and nobody walked through it to see what was on the other side. To this day, it is one of the great unexamined questions of the case. While those first doors were being flung open and forgotten, something else was happening. Something that had almost never happened in America before. The disappearance was becoming a national obsession. Put this in its proper place in history. This was decades before the Lindbergh baby. It was more than 80 years before the entire country demanded to know what happened to John Benet Ramsey. Catherine Winters was, for a brief and blazing moment, one of the very first missing children in America to become a coast-to-coast sensation. Her photograph ran in newspapers and magazines from one ocean to the other. The telegraph and telephone lines, people said, were burdened for weeks with nothing but the Winters case. And in an age when moving pictures were still a novelty, someone made a newsreel about her and sent it across the country. Audiences sat in the dark in distant cities and studied the face of the lost Indiana girl, in case one of them might recognize her. That film still exists. More than a century later, you can still watch that flickering footage. A grieving town mated in one desperate hope, that somewhere, in some far-off theater, a single stranger in the crowd would know Catherine's face and bring her home. The town filled with reporters, and with the strange gravity a famous mystery pulls toward itself. Clairvoyants arrived, people who claimed to have seen Catherine in dreams, fortune-tellers with visions, everyone drawn to a hole in the world where an answer ought to be. And then there was the detective. The mayor wanted results, and a private investigator named Abel came to deliver them. The newspapers could hardly believe what they saw. He arrived dressed almost like a character from a storybook, a cap in the Sherlock Holmes style, a meerschaum pipe, an oversized magnifying glass held to his eye, and tucked under his arm, a bulky early listening machine called a dictograph, which he apparently meant to use to secretly record the conversations of suspects. The mayor dangled a reward of $3,000 if he cracked it, close to $70,000 in today's money. Rewards were posted. Appeals went out on the wires. For a while, the whole machinery of a modern manhunt, primitive as it was in 1913, was aimed at a single missing fourth grader from Indiana. And it is worth remembering what that machinery was working against. The Great Flood had torn through the region in those same early days, washing out roads, drowning fields, scattering the very ground a search would need to cover. The case was born into chaos, and never fully climbed out of it. It sounds like a comedy. A pipe, a cap, a magnifying glass, a spy machine, a fortune on the table. But strip away the costume and see what it really means. This quiet town had become a stage. The vanishing of one small girl had turned into a national performance, with a costume detective and a cash prize at its center. And underneath all that noise, a third door was quietly opening, the one that led away on the rails. Catherine had family far off in Wisconsin, a grandmother, an aunt, and some people in Newcastle said it openly. Perhaps the relatives had taken the girl, perhaps for ransom. Investigators pushed hard in that direction too, all the way to another state. It went nowhere. The trains themselves became their own door. A traveling salesman swore, under oath, that he had seen Catherine aboard a Chicago-bound train, sitting beside an older woman. Others reported glimpses of her on trains crossing the region, always moving, always just out of reach, always gone before anyone could confirm it. Every one of those sightings was chased down. Every one of them dissolved in the hand of whoever reached for it. Years later, this same door produced its strangest visitor of all. A decade after Catherine vanished, a grown woman in Ohio went to a fortune teller who told her she had lived under many names. The remark unlocked a flood of half-formed memories, and the woman began to believe she herself might be the long-lost Catherine Winters, somehow grown up in another life. She went to the newspapers with it. Catherine's father traveled to see for himself. One look at her photograph was all it took. She was not his daughter. Every door on the open road, every door on the rails, every door to a distant relative, opened onto the same nothing, which left the last door, the one nobody in that grieving family wanted anyone to open, the door back into the house on 16th Street. And to understand why the town was finally willing to look there, you have to understand that the man at the center of it was himself a riddle. The newspapers of the time could not even agree on who Dr. Winters was. In some accounts, he is the perfect grieving father, a man who wore the skin off his knuckles on strangers' doors, who crossed the country and spent himself into poverty chasing his lost girl, who never once stopped searching. But in other accounts, a very different man appears. One with a drinking problem, one who got into repeated, ugly confrontations with reporters and with town officials. Volatile, combative, not the calm, blameless victim of the first portrait at all. Both men wore the same name. And to this day, no one can say for certain which was the real Dr. Winters, or whether, somehow, he was both. And that ambiguity is exactly why the last door was so easy for the town to push open. When you cannot decide whether a man is a saint or a danger, it becomes very easy to imagine the worst. Then one of the prosecutors said something in the newspapers that changed the temperature of the entire case. He said the Winters' home life had not been a happy one, and once that idea was loose in the air, the investigators' attention settled on 3 people inside that house: the father, the stepmother, Bird, and a third person who had been living there, a boarder. Bird had not come from money. Before she married into the Winters family, she had worked for her living, in a boarding house, at a local hotel, behind the counters of downtown department stores. She had married Dr. Winters only a few years before Catherine vanished, stepping into the role of stepmother to another woman's children. By some accounts, she was a devoted stepmother, who sewed beautiful clothes for Catherine in the hope she would come home to wear them. By others, she was something far worse. Which of those was true is one more thing the case never settled. His name was William Ross Cooper. He was a telegraph operator for the railroad, and he had lost one of his arms years before in a hunting accident. He had paid to live with the Winters family until shortly before Catherine disappeared. And the theory the press began to build around these three was a dark one. It was whispered that Cooper and the stepmother had been carrying on an affair, and that the one person who might have discovered it was a 9-year-old girl who lived in that house, sharp enough to notice, young enough to say something out loud. I want to be careful and fair here, because these were real people, and nothing that was alleged against them was ever proven in any court. This was a theory, a suspicion, a story stitched together from a troubled household and a town that was desperate, after months of failure, for someone to blame. But the suspicion did not stay a story for long, because the investigators went down into the basement of that house, and they said they found something. The basement was reached through a trapdoor, and down there, investigators reported recovering a small handful of items that would become the only physical evidence the case ever produced. A red sweater, a blue hair ribbon, and a man's undershirt with a stain on it. Now, every one of those items was fiercely disputed then, and has been ever since. Was the sweater truly Catherine's, or simply a sweater? Was the ribbon hers, or any child's ribbon? The evidence was thin, contested, and open to a dozen innocent explanations. But in the fever of 1913, with a town inflamed and a nation watching, it was enough. The father, the stepmother, and the boarder were all arrested and charged in connection with Catherine's death. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. The search had begun with a frantic father pounding on doors, screaming that strangers had stolen his little girl. And it had arrived, step by step, at that very same father standing accused, beside his wife, of being the answer himself. The case seemed, at last, to be closing. A theory, a motive, evidence, 3 people in custody, and then the whole thing collapsed. Because suspicion is not proof, and a disputed sweater is not a child. Roughly 14 months after Catherine walked out of that house and into nothing, a judge named Edward Jackson looked at the case. He weighed everything the state had managed to assemble against the 3 of them, and he ended it. He called the proceedings off, citing one plain and deflating fact. There was not enough evidence. There would be no trial. The father, the stepmother, and the boarder were released. The case did not close with an answer. It closed with a shrug. No trial, no verdict, no conviction. And, above everything else, no Catherine. The 3 walked back out into their lives beneath a cloud that never lifted. The boarder, Cooper, drifted quietly back into an ordinary existence. He moved away, married, and returned to his work on the railroad, as though the accusation had never touched him. Whatever he knew, or did not know, he carried it silently to the end of his days. The suspicion clung heaviest and longest to the stepmother. It has followed her name, fairly or not, right up to the present day. But settling on a person is not the same as proving a thing, and against none of the 3 was anything ever proven. So the last door, like all the others, refused to open, and the town was left exactly where it had started, with a missing girl, and no idea on earth what had become of her. There was, in the end, one final theory, the darkest of them all, that Catherine had never left Newcastle at all, that her body had been hidden somewhere in a town full of construction, in a city whose railroads were forever being torn up and rebuilt. Decades later, that theory was even tested with a hammer. There was a tall cement pyramid near a brook, an old base that had once supported a train bridge. Long after the case had gone cold, when the structure was finally demolished, people watched the rubble to see what it might give up. It gave up nothing, not one human bone. And so that door, too, swung shut on an empty room. The mystery simply rolled on into another generation, still open, still unanswered. It has never once come close to closing. But behind every one of those doors, behind all the theories and sightings and spectacle, there was a family. And what this did to them is, in some ways, the quietest and the saddest part of the whole story. Catherine's father never stopped looking. Not for a year, not for a decade, for the rest of his life. He traveled thousands of miles chasing leads. He ran down every rumor, followed every possible Catherine to every possible town, and spent his money on it until there was little left. He had begun that search on the very first afternoon, pounding on doors, never once imagining it would swallow every remaining year he had. He even found a kidnapped girl once, a child taken in Louisiana and carried off to Ohio. He helped return her to her family, and the man responsible was arrested. But she belonged to someone else. She was not Catherine. Dr. Winters died in 1940, 27 years after that spring morning, and the last words he is said to have spoken carry the full weight of all those years in a single line. He said, "Now I will find out what happened to Catherine." He was buried near a small Indiana town, beside his second wife, the stepmother who had shared both the accusation and the endless, unanswered grief. And there was the little brother, Frankie. He was only 7 when his sister vanished, and the two of them had been close. On the night she disappeared, he would not eat his dinner. And for more than a year afterward, he kept a special Easter egg tucked away, saving it, waiting, for a sister who was never coming home to share it. Frankie grew up in the long shadow of the most famous mystery in Indiana. He finished high school, and then he left. By most accounts, he never came back. He moved far away, to California, worked as an attendant in a hospital, and died in 1955, still a relatively young man. The house on 16th Street held its ghosts in the most literal way. For years afterward, up in the attic, reached by a trapdoor in the ceiling, Catherine's doll stayed exactly where it had been left. Her little doll buggy, the missing person posters, the scattered keepsakes of a search that never found its object. A whole childhood, and a whole mystery, sealed away in an attic like a breath held for decades, waiting for someone to come back and finish it. And the town never let her go either. To this day, Newcastle carries her ghost stories, her legends, the whispered sightings and the quiet theories. Every so often, someone new picks up the old thread. A writer, a filmmaker, an investigator. They breathe the dust off the old files and try, once more, to answer the only question that has ever mattered here. And so far, every last one of them has failed. Every March, the anniversary of that spring morning comes around again, and in Newcastle it is still marked. People still gather. A library program, a new theory, a fresh face convinced they can finally crack what a century of others could not. The date that began an obsession in 1913 has never stopped being observed. The list of people who have tried is almost its own strange monument. Reporters who spent 40 years digging through the old files. Authors who wrote entire books trying to answer the title question. Filmmakers, ghost hunters, drawn by rumors of a child's spirit and bones beneath old houses. School teachers, factory workers, and self-described psychics with prophetic dreams. Generation after generation, they have breathed in the dust of this case and walked away empty-handed. One veteran reporter who spent decades on it summed the whole thing up in 6 words. "You can't make this up," he said. "It has everything." He was right. It has everything except an ending. So here is where we are left, more than a century on. A 9-year-old girl went out one spring morning to knock on doors and sell needles for her church. She was seen by more than a dozen people who knew her, in the middle of a busy town, in the full light of day. She traded a few ordinary words with a family friend near the courthouse, right around noon. And then she stepped through one last door, and was gone. The traveling strangers everyone blamed were never once tied to her. The stranger in the buggy, who had taken another child 6 days before, was never caught or questioned about her. The relatives were cleared. The trains led nowhere. And the family that the town finally turned on was never proven to have done a single thing. Every door, locked, every one. The one man who searched hardest died with the question still on his lips. And the answer, if the earth ever truly held one, was never given back. So I will hand the last door to you. Was it the open road, or the passing stranger in the buggy, or the quiet house a prosecutor called unhappy? After 100 years, an honest guess is all any of us has left. Tell me which door you would open, down in the comments. I read every single one.